Good evening and welcome to the National Conservation Training Center. Tina has very nicely put up the name of our Conservation Lecture Series, the first speaker in 28 years to do so. Thank you, Tina. So you know you're in the right spot. My name is Mark Madison. I'm one of the organizers of this. We've been doing it 28 years, and this is by far the youngest audience we've ever had. So we are very fortunate to have a number of super bright, motivated, future environmental leaders here, high school students from around the country, along with their faculty for the SC3 event we put on every summer, and they're going to join us this evening. Tonight we're extremely fortunate to have a speaker who's helping us deal with some grief. We recently lost 3 little eaglets we had on our bald eagle nest here on campus. A storm literally kind of out of the Wizard of Oz knocked the nest right out of the tree, and the eaglets were too young to fly. Luckily, Tina Morris is coming to us tonight with a much more positive story about raising some eaglets in her wonderful book, Return to the Sky, the surprising story of how one woman and 7 eaglets helped restore the bald eagle. Let me tell you a little about Tina. Tina was raised in a large family and surrounded by myriad orphan creatures, both domestic and wild. This will play a role in her story. And she was imbued with a lifelong love of animals. I love this line. After a few wrong turns and a stormy relationship with science, in college, she found a way to make her life's ambition, rescuing endangered birds of prey, into a reality. Tina earned her undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and her graduate degree in ornithology and wildlife biology from Cornell University, where she helped develop the first techniques for releasing introduced bald eagles. Her field research ultimately became the instruction manual for eagle restoration programs in other eastern states. And Tina was formally inducted as an honorary Iroquois into the Confederacy of the Six Nations for her work, returning the bald eagle to the nation's skies. You're in for a treat. It's a wonderful book. She's an amazing person. Please give a warm welcome to Tina Morris.
Thank you, Mark, for such a great introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here today. I think partly because the SC3, if I got that right, I've been trying to memorize those, okay, is here. And I was a teacher for 25 years, your age, and it's just wonderful for me to be able to talk to you tonight about what I did after I went through high school. So I'm going to be speaking to you about my book, Return to the Sky, the story of the bald eagles I was trying to save almost 50 years ago. Tonight I'll be focusing on those eagles and the project that brought them back to the northeastern and southeastern U.S. If you read the book, you can find out how my life was changed by the program. But for now, the 7 eaglets will take center stage. And just like their spectacular relatives who are now ranging throughout the eastern U.S., they do this very well. The 1970s were a time of magic in bird conservation, and this talk is dedicated to those people who made it happen. It is also a positive story, which we all probably need to hear today in light of the recent reports of bird decline. There's another reason why it is an honor to speak to you tonight. As some of you might know, on Christmas Eve over 6 months ago, President Biden signed a book designating the bald eagle as our national bird. Now, many of us, including me, had thought it was already our national bird. But a dedicated supporter of the National Eagle Center in Wabasha, Minnesota, named Preston Cook, discovered the government had never actually officially named it as such. With the help of Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota, he was able to convince both houses of Congress, which says a lot these days, to pass legislation which made it to the president's desk just before he was to leave office. We can now accurately refer to the eagle as the nation's bird and have Preston Cook to thank for it. The saga of the bald eagle's return was inextricably tied to that of the peregrine falcon. Without its smaller and faster friend to set the pace, the success of the Eagle Project might not have been so auspicious. The raptor biologists who were responsible for the reintroduction of the peregrine in 1973 were also the driving force behind the restoration of the eagle 3 years later. The story of the eagle and the peregrine began in Ithaca, in central New York State, home to Cornell University. Perched on the southern end of Cayuga Lake, one of the Finger Lakes, so named because of their long and skinny shapes, Cornell was known for its world-renowned Laboratory of Ornithology. In the 1970s, it was also the epicenter for raptor reintroductions. We need to back up a decade, however, to the seminal event that started everything. In 1962, a marine biologist named Rachel Carson, and I noticed that you have a lodge, which I'm staying in, named after her, wrote Silent Spring, the book that sounded the alarm about the lethal effects of the pesticide DDT. At the time, few biologists paid attention to Carson, partly because of her doomsday predictions and partly because of her gender. Women in science at the time were very scarce, which allowed the scientific community to dismiss her. It was her findings about DDT, a long-lasting pesticide used to combat malaria in World War II, that made Carson a main character in the bald eagle story. She discovered that DDT wasn't just killing the mosquitoes it was meant to control, but was also breaking down into its metabolite, DDE, which was absorbed by the algae, fish, and other aquatic organisms consumed by birds. Once ingested, DDE interfered with the calcium metabolism of the bird's eggs, resulting in thinner shells and breakage as soon as the birds tried to incubate them. Although all birds were being affected, it was the ones at the top of the food chain that were most at risk: the ospreys, the pelicans, and the bald eagles who eat fish, and the peregrine falcons who eat smaller birds, who in turn eat insect seeds and other food contaminated by the poison. Through a process called biomagnification, the pesticide was consumed by species at each trophic level. Its concentration increased with every step up the food chain until its final and top destination, the predators. Sadly, Rachel Carson died at the age of 56, only 2 years after her book was published. But her findings had been corroborated by scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey's Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland. The bird world was shocked by the truth that explained the decline of so many of their beloved species. Carson's cause was taken up by a group of people with personal interests in the raptors affected by DDT, particularly peregrine falcons. In 1965, led by a falconer named Joe Hickey, a professor at the University of Wisconsin, a conference was held in Madison to discuss the problem. At that meeting, the Raptor Research Foundation was born. The 1970s became the age of enlightenment as the federal government took up the cause of environmental degradation. Under Richard Nixon, whose administration, unbeknownst to many, had a strong commitment to the environment, legislation began to be passed to curb our decline. In 1970, Joe Hickey organized a second meeting in Madison, this time to call for the ban of DDT. In December of that year, the EPA was established to be the watchdog for clean air and water. Although DDT wasn't officially banned until 1972, the race was on to save the birds. Preparing the stage further to restore species like the peregrine and the eagle was the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, protecting not only the species, but also their habitat. Let me introduce the fathers of falconry. 3 men were most instrumental in addressing the plight of peregrines. Tom Cade was a falconer and ornithology professor at Syracuse University before he came to Cornell. Heinz Meng, who was mastering the art of captive breeding of falcons at SUNY New Paltz in New York, and of course, Joe Hickey. Although the falconry world was close-knit and everyone helped each other as they considered how best to save the peregrine, it was Tom Cade who established the program that would bring it back. He moved from Syracuse to Cornell with the stipulation that he could build a captive breeding facility in Ithaca. Because there were no peregrines left in the Northeast, it was imperative that captive breeding of subspecies from other regions happened. Dr. Cade created a facility known to the Cornell community as the Hawk Barn. The barn was divided into flight cages with nesting ledges to resemble the peregrine's natural eyries. Here, the art of artificial insemination was mastered, although excited male peregrines forced their handlers to wear some self-defense equipment like this modified copulation helmet with a lip around it to catch the semen while protecting their heads. The peregrine program used hacking, a training technique borrowed from falconry, whereby young birds are raised and released without parents. Sometimes these young falcons can be bred in captivity, and sometimes they are taken from the nest at a young age. In the latter case, the birds have imprinted on their parents before they're released, so they will mature and live as members of their species. The peregrine falcon program placed young falcons into hacking boxes where they were fed and protected by human caretakers who stayed out of sight as much as possible until the young were ready to fly and catch food on their own. The hack boxes were placed in areas that most closely replicated peregrine's natural habitat, such as cliff sides or ledges, towers, or even bridges when the program eventually moved into the cities in order to avoid predation from animals like great horned owls and raccoons, who would prey on the young falcons at night. The peregrine releases, begun in 1973, served as the model for the Bald Eagle Project. Having witnessed the success of the peregrine program, New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation foresaw the year 1976 as the ideal time to bring the eagle back from the brink of extinction. By then, DDT had decimated the populations in all states of the Northeast, except for a few breeding pairs still in Maine. Patriotic fever was running high, and nobody could imagine celebrating the Bicentennial without what they believed to be at the time their national bird. After its ban in 1972, DDT levels detected in fish declined precipitously. By the mid-1970s, the bald eagle former habitat had become clean enough to receive birds again. Although almost gone from the sky, the eagle's image was ubiquitous, appearing on our currency, on sports team logos. After all, the Philadelphia Eagles even won the Super Bowl because the eagle was on their helmets. And of course, on our national seal, despite Ben Franklin's disdain for the eagle, which he considered to be of bad moral character, supposedly because of its scavenger nature. The turkey and other contenders didn't stand a chance against the grandeur of the bald eagle, when our forefathers had to select a symbol of freedom, majesty, and power to represent the newly independent USA. By 1976, in the lower 48 states, eagles had been reduced to only 417 pairs, a number too low to sustain the species. According to the terms of the Endangered Species Act, the federal government controlled the bald eagle, so New York needed permission from the Department of the Interior to launch a reintroduction program. DEC's proposal to release eagles was denied due to the state agency not having any raptor biologists on staff who could lead it. Enter Tom Cade and his young and inexperienced wannabe graduate student, me. I had arrived at Cornell to pursue my dream to work with Dr. Cade and save birds of prey. But when he told me I needed a funded program to be accepted as one of his students, my dream started to plummet. Then, by pure serendipity, I had a chance meeting with two Fish and Wildlife administrators in Washington in charge of the defunct eagle proposal. And things took a sudden turn. They asked Tom Cade to head the program for eagles due to his expertise with introducing peregrines. If I would be willing to work with the eagles, Dr. Cade said, he would be willing to supervise the project, and the eagle program would be possible. A deal was made, and the project began officially in June 1976, but the groundwork started to be laid in the fall before that. The first order of business was to find a suitable site in New York from which to reintroduce the birds. Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge near Seneca Falls at the northern end of Cayuga Lake was selected. Montezuma met all the requirements needed for a release site. Food would be plentiful in the 10,000-acre wetland complex where marsh, rivers, and open water were prevalent. The presence of a wide variety of water birds and fish guaranteed its food potential for young bald eagles as well as adults returning to breed. Protection of the young eaglets was paramount, so the release site had to be able to be cordoned off and made inaccessible to the public. Clark's Ridge, a hilltop overlooking Shockey Pool, the largest water body in the marsh, was hidden amidst a labyrinth of dirt roads that traversed farmland around the refuge, making it impossible to locate it. Luckily, this was before the days of GPS and Google Maps. It was important that the site be near Cornell, so the peregrine team could be available for me in case I had emergencies. The drive from Ithaca to the refuge took less than an hour. Bald eagles prefer to nest in tall trees with strong branches which the young use as practice perches when they're first learning to fly. Nests are often built in the V formed by these branches. The adults like to be able to see around them, so height and being on the edge of the forest is important. Montezuma had many hardwoods surrounding the wetland areas, perfect for future nests. Once the site was chosen, the next dilemma was finding a source for young eaglets that could be transported to New York. Because there was no sustainable population left in any of the surrounding states, it would be necessary to go further afield to find an area where DDT hadn't left its mark. Alaska had plenty of bald eagles, but the genetic makeup of this much larger subspecies was thought to be too different to take a chance on. Instead, the program looked to the Midwest, particularly the Great Lakes states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, where DDT hadn't been used as it had in the Northeast, and where a healthy population of bald eagles could be found. Bald eagles generally lay 3 eggs and try to rear 3 young. However, because of food supply and energy expenditure, often the third eaglet is smaller and weaker than its siblings and doesn't make it. They are either thrown from the nest or pushed aside by the stronger ones until they starve. Therefore, the plan was to select the third eaglet from these 3 bird nests for transport. When the climbers scaled the nest trees to band the young eaglets at about 7 weeks of age, it was up to them to determine which birds to select. The position of the nest tower in the refuge was critical. Not only did it have to be hidden from the public, it had to be high enough for the young birds to survey the land around them. Near tall trees they could use as perches once they started to fly, and most of all near the water. Clark's Ridge met all these criteria. The local electric company donated and installed 4 35-foot-high poles for the tower, on top of which we constructed a 7-foot platform. My Peregrine team colleagues, Jim Weaver and Willard Heck, and I had to think like eagle parents and build a nest for them closely resembling the nest where they had come from. The next step was to create a canvas blind or hide next to the platform so I could observe and feed the birds without them seeing me. The blind was barely large enough for me to sit in cross-legged. On the side facing the nest was a hole through which I could feed the birds with a long barbecue fork, so they wouldn't view humans as their providers or food source, a dangerous situation for both species. At first, I had to climb to the platform using metal pegs, like those used by electric linemen. But once the scaffolding was up, my ascent became far easier and a bit less scary. We wrapped aluminum predator guards around the poles to prevent animals like raccoons from reaching the young birds at night. The day finally came on June 18, 1976, when Wisconsin Fish and Wildlife climbers called to say they had 2 eaglets ready to ship to New York. Arriving at Syracuse Airport in 2 separate crates, the birds known as W1 and W2, W for Wisconsin, 1 for a female, 2 for the male, were retrieved by federal officials and driven to the refuge an hour away. On hand to receive the eaglets was a large contingent of state, federal, and refuge personnel. A few biologists from Cornell, Tom Cade, me, and my 2 dogs, Max and Moses. While most of the entourage stood at the base of the tower looking up, Dr. Cade tied the ropes around the crates, Jim Weaver hauled them up to the top of the tower, and Dr. Cade and I pried open the tops and released them. The eaglets had been shrieking while in the crates with their call-like cry until they were able to jump onto their new nest and seek shelter in the corner of the platform as far away from their captors as possible. These weren't cuddly, tame birds who wanted to be our friends, and for this we were all grateful. They had to have a big fear of humans if they were to survive. After the eaglets settled down and the crowd dispersed, I was left alone on the hillside with my dogs, wondering how on earth the eagles and I were going to survive the next 3 months. The first order of business was to set up my campsite, including my tent, my camp stove, and all the paraphernalia required to take care of the eagles. To observe the birds, even when I wasn't up in the blind, I had a remote video camera with a monitor in the tent. The picture was a bit fuzzy by modern standards, but at least I could see they were okay. Many of you have experienced more advanced technology, especially if you have tuned in to any of the eagle cams throughout the country, even here in this area and also in Big Bear Valley, California, some of you may have seen, where thousands of viewers focused on the pair Jackie and Shadow hatching eggs after 2 years of failure. Both their nestlings fledged a few weeks ago to great fanfare across the country. The images are so clear you feel that you are in the nest with them. The next order of business was to feed the young birds. The marshes were teeming with carp, but I had to catch them and stockpile them so they would be available for 2 meals a day. In the first year, fish were plentiful, and I trapped them in a spillway. Then I moved them to a large cage in the water where I could net them whenever I needed to. In the next year, however, we had a severe drought, which decimated the carp, and I had to make quick friends with the local fishermen in order to restock my supply. Eagles are opportunistic feeders, so although fish is a mainstay of their diet, they also eat small mammals and water birds as well as scavenge for carrion. To give them a balanced diet and introduce them to the varied prey items and delicacies that awaited them in the real world, I had to find roadkill. I spent hours driving the roads around the refuge, picking up rabbits, squirrels, muskrats, woodchucks, snakes, and other tasty morsels. By the way, rabbits were the food of choice. I knew we had to be able to track the eaglets when they left the nest, so banding and equipping them with radios became the next step before they fledged. Surveillance methods, especially for eagles, were in their infancy back in 1976, so everything we did was trial and error. With Jim Weaver's help and experience and lots of experimenting, we eventually worked out how to attach a short-term radio to the eagles and to put colored tags on their wings that could withstand the weather and be seen from a distance. Because of their dependence on flight for hunting and migration, it was essential to ensure these apparatuses didn't interfere with their wing movement. We had to modify things a lot between 1976 and 77 when we figured out what worked best and what didn't. My issue was going to be restraining the eagles, especially when I had to handle them alone, which was most of the time. For this, I experimented with several body wraps, but what worked best in the end, believe it or not, was my blue jeans. I cut off the leg, and its tapering shape fit like a straitjacket. Perfect fit for an eagle. He couldn't move his wings, and with his talons wrapped with electrical tape, his beak unable to reach my hands, he was safe and secure, as was I. After spending my days watching and recording the eaglets' behavior from the blind, I noticed a significant increase in their energy level. Increasingly more restless and energetic, they began hopping all over the platform, flapping their wings as they practiced their pre-flight maneuvers, and even banging their heads on the top of the enclosure as they gained altitude. It was finally time to remove the bars and let them out on the perch before they hurt themselves. We had nailed one to the tower. Before long, they made their first flight. I had little time to celebrate as they spread their wings for the first time. Like all young creatures, first steps, or in this case flights, are a bit shaky. An eagle's size works against it when first taking off. So it looks like an out-of-control helicopter as it struggles to find a landing place. This usually was into the marsh far below the hillside, its thick cattail stands interspersed with small pools of water. Without wind to help with lift, the young eagles couldn't become elevated, so were stuck. If they had had parents, they would have fed them on the ground and watched over them until their wings were stronger. But it was up to me to find them, catch them, and return them to their nest on top of the tower for a second try and sometimes a third try. Hauling a struggling eagle under one arm while gripping the ladder with the other one is never an easy task. Eventually, they grew stronger and were able to reach a perch, either on one of the trees near the nest or the dead snags in the marsh. The 1976 eaglets spent a few months exploring the areas inside and outside the refuge, learning how to catch their own food, until hunting season in October. Then they left the refuge for good, leaving me to wonder if they would survive all the threats that awaited them in the outside world. Once their radio's batteries died after a few weeks, there was no way to follow them, so all I could do was hope. In late winter and spring of 1977, we began to prepare for the next group of eagles. The decision to hack 4 birds had been made based on the success of the previous year. The scaffolding had to be removed so a second nest platform could be built. The blind was placed between the 2 nests so I could observe and feed both sets of eagles. With the scaffolding gone, I was back to the metal pegs for climbing. Like a mountain goat, I would clamber up the platform, push aside the plywood door to my blind, and haul myself inside, all while trying not to make any noise that could disturb the birds. In one of these photos on the left, you can see my blue jean cut-off shorts, whose legs were now in use as the sleeves to restrain the eagles. In 1977, 2 of our eaglets were taken from 3 bird nests, one from Michigan, M1, and one from Minnesota, M2. But we also wanted to use captive-bred birds for the first time. Patuxent Wildlife Research Center offered us 2 eaglets raised by eagle parents held in captivity there. There turned out to be a huge difference between the captive-bred birds and the wild birds, partly because of size and maturity of the caged birds. They had been fed an unlimited diet at Patuxent, had been around people a lot and were feistier and more precocious than the wild birds. They had no desire to be contained behind bars and went out to the perch early after arriving. Sometimes they hopped onto the roof for a better view. The video camera had been moved to a pole next to the nest tower so it could capture both nests and record their activity back to the trailer that had replaced my cozy tent from the previous year. In July, a game of musical chairs was in order. All 4 eaglets were still confined in their nests when I was told I would be welcoming a new arrival. A 3rd eaglet with a broken leg had been discovered and rescued by the climbers in Michigan when they were securing our eaglet M1. The injured bird, whom I called M3, was sent to the Vet College of the University of Minnesota where he was treated and rehabbed. He was now ready to be released and was on his way to me. Since the 2 Patuxent birds in M1, the female from Michigan, were ready to fledge, I opened the bars on one cage so they could come and go. In the other cage, I put M3 in with M2, the male from Minnesota. We will hear about M3 later in this talk, but for now, suffice to say, he was the calmest and most endearing of all the birds I cared for. The secrecy surrounding the Eagle Project was well kept during the first year. Everyone was worried about vandalism if the public knew the eagles were on the ridge, and there was a little bit of worry about me being alone with my 2 dogs in the middle of nowhere. There was also uncertainty about whether the program would succeed, and the government folks didn't want it advertised until they were sure the eagles had at least survived long enough to leave the refuge. In 1977, such secrecy was abandoned, and I was besieged by media anxious for a juicy story. Reporters would come for an interview armed with their cameras, and I would find a simple snapshot used to lure readers to a front-page article on the cover of the New York Times about the birds and their young female caretaker. My camera-shy nature was not well suited to this new role I found myself in. Some of the notoriety was welcome, however. In the fall of 1977, I was invited to attend the New York State Fair in Syracuse to be inducted into the Iroquois Confederacy as an honorary member of the Iroquois Nation. Although I was nervous about going, it was a memory I will savor forever. I spent the day with members of the 6 nations of the Iroquois, learned about their customs and culture, and was lavished with handmade gifts from each group, including a sacred eagle feather, which I have to this day. Apparently, I was the first female to receive such an honor, allowing the wives of the chiefs to be part of the event, an historic moment for them as well. After the eagles left the refuge in the fall of 1977, my tenure as the eagle caretaker was over. Although I never saw these eagles catch their own food, they seemed to be independent and had stopped coming to the tower for the fish that I'd left for them, a sure sign they'd found a better option for themselves. I returned to Ithaca and completed my thesis, which became the manual on hacking bald eagles. By the 1980s, 9 other states had adopted our hacking procedures and were releasing eagles. The last state to do so was Tennessee, which hacked birds until 2020, exceeding even New York's total of 198. New York continued to hack eagles in Montezuma from 1978 to 1981, deciding eventually to move the project to other sites in the state to allow for breeding birds to return to their natal area without becoming overcrowded. As it turned out, eagles aren't as averse to nesting near each other as we had thought, as long as there is an ample food supply, which explains today's existence of 28 active nests in a 25-mile radius of Montezuma. As the hacking projects increased, the states had to reach further afield to find healthy eaglets for transport. While New York and other northeastern states were using Alaskan birds by then, deciding that the genetic differences wouldn't be that much of a problem, other states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey connected with Saskatchewan and other Canadian provinces. Massachusetts brought in eaglets from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. This cross-border cooperation between our 2 countries allowed many eagles to return to the skies of the northeastern and southeastern U.S. We owe Canada a lot of thanks. Looking at New England and New York, we can see the dramatic increase in breeding eagle pairs since 1967, when DDT was still a threat. Only Maine had breeding pairs, and just 21 at the time. By 2023, Maine still won the prize with over 800 pairs, with New York a close second with 426. Virginia and West Virginia boasted their own eagle successes after 1970, with both states increasing their numbers of breeding pairs dramatically through 2007, when the species was removed from the endangered species list. By 2020, the Chesapeake Bay area eagles had 3,000 eagle pairs, up from about 60 in the 1970s. The success of the eagles in this area was most visible with the nest built in a sycamore tree right here at NCTC in 2003. This nest was used successfully for 22 years, culminating in the birth of 3 eaglets in 2025. Tragically, a violent windstorm blew down the nest with the nestlings only 4 weeks of age, not able to survive the fall. I have heard that the parents, both of whom survived, might be investigating another nest further down on the tree for next year. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Circling back to Montezuma for a minute and the 7 eaglets I had raised back in 1976 and 1977, my Wisconsin eaglets, W1 and W2, turned out to be siblings, taken from the same nest. Their bond never wavered after they left the refuge, and they went on to mate and nest near Watertown, New York, a couple of hours away, raising 1 eaglet in 1980. But the most exciting news was that of M3, the rehabbed eagle from Michigan. I had lost track of him, along with the other eagles from that year, and could only hope they had survived. In June 2015, I received a press release from the DEC of New York that his body had been recovered, the victim of a vehicle hit. He had a band on his leg that identified him as one of my 1977 eagles. He was 38 years old, the oldest wild eagle ever known, and had been nesting at Hemlock Lake, the last remaining eagle nest when the project was begun. Breeding for 35 years with 2 different mates, he could have produced as many as 70 eaglets during his lifetime. I was indeed a proud mama. 2 other eagles, hacked by DEC later on, had also been identified as part of the famous trio, a family of 2 males and 1 female who returned to nest in the refuge in 1987. New York's goal was to put 10 breeding pairs back into the skies. These maps of nesting territories every 10 years show how successful eagles became at surpassing this goal. Today, in the continental U.S., eagles are most numerous in the Midwest and along the Atlantic Flyway. Minnesota has the 2nd largest population, Florida the 3rd, next to Alaska, which boasts about half of the total bald eagle breeding population. The timeline of the bald eagle's recovery is defined by several key pieces of legislation and moments in the U.S. history of conservation, beginning in 1940 with the Bald Eagle Protection Act. By 2007, the eagle had recovered enough to be removed from the endangered species list, although states like Tennessee were still hacking them back to the wild for 13 more years. After 1977, I never returned to Montezuma, although I passed it on the thruway and always craned my neck searching for the tower on Clark's Ridge. I followed the news about the hacked eagles as best I could, but once Dr. Cade moved the Peregrine Fund to Boise, Idaho, and merged it with the World Center for the Birds of Prey, my source of information was gone. In 2019, Tom Cade died, and by 2020, I felt the story about the origins of this project needed to be told. I knew this meant returning to the marshes to see the eagles again. In November 2022, my husband and I were shocked when we drove into the refuge. When I had left almost 45 years before, there were no nesting eagles and almost no sign that the species would ever become the signature species of the refuge. Now we passed many images of eagles welcoming visitors. After I convinced the current refuge staff that I had been the one to start the Eagle Project, thanks to the expertise of the Cornell Peregrine Fund and Tom Cade, I was given the keys to the city, or the refuge as it were. I was shown the giant sculpture designed by Jay Seaman for the 40th anniversary of the reintroduction program that sits on the edge of the refuge adjacent to the New York Thruway. Accompanied by our Montezuma guides, we bushwhacked our way up to Clark's Ridge, long overgrown but still the home of the nest tower, albeit a bit bedraggled all these years later. Even the box holding the video camera was still intact. I went down memory lane with my patient listeners as they heard about the project, the start of the eagle recovery, and the role Cornell had played in its design. Today, 9 bald eagle nests are active in the refuge, with 14 more in the wetlands complex surrounding the boundaries. Some pairs even build 2 nests, perhaps as insurance against disaster, or maybe, I like to think, they are feeling so secure and comfortable they want a winter and a summer home. As we stood on the dike road that runs along Shockey Pool, where I had once rescued so many youngsters from the cattails, adult and immature eagles were flying all around us. Here I would like to share what was racing through my mind at this time by reading a short passage from the book about this experience. Several eagles fly over my head towards a group of red maples hugging the inner tributary. Adults land on tree limbs overhanging the dike road, while the immatures, 6 altogether, with their uniforms of chocolate brown from head to toe, perch like preschoolers in one of 2 adjacent trees. I want to call the class to order, to watch and listen and tell them where they have come from and what it means for them to be here on this day. I want to tell them about their grandparents, those stalwart 7 eagles and the others who followed them, whose resilience and persistence paved the way for their return to this refuge 50 years ago. I want to stand there, alone with my birds, until they can grasp their own significance. The water is high, the current swift. It would be impossible to cross to the field of cattails in the distance without a boat. It would be at least chest high and require waders to navigate it. But I know it is possible. In this massive vegetation, interspersed with standing pools of water, invisible from the outside world, had once been 7 hapless eaglets, each rescued from certain disaster by a young researcher, so desperate to reach her quarry she didn't notice how deep the water was, how thick the grasses were, how many times she'd fall into the cavities below her. Had that really happened? Surely the river today must be wider, deeper, the Erie Canal forcing manipulation of the water levels over the years. As I begin to question my memories, seeking clarification at every step of my mind travel, I look up at the hillside, my hillside. Nothing but trees can be seen from down here on the dike road. But wait, there is a shadow behind the tallest ones, a bare silhouette of telephone poles, straighter and darker than trees. Something is there, but I can't be sure. Although my heart is gladdened by the sight of so many bald eagles today, I know that their success in increased numbers haven't been without criticism. Many people don't like having predators in their world, or don't understand that an ecosystem is most healthy when every trophic level is full and balanced. An apex predator like a bald eagle can have enemies among humans who find it hard to watch him take fish from an osprey, or attack its chicks, or take over its platform, or harass loons or herons who are nesting in their lake. Making room for all species is not something we humans do easily. Instead, we pick sides, and often the underdog becomes our cause. We have forgotten that almost 50 years ago, the bald eagle was the underdog, and only with our help and vigilance was saved from extinction. I hope we can learn to champion his comeback, to be tolerant when he behaves according to his true nature, and to ensure the threats that still exist in his world are mitigated so as not to repeat the damage of DDT. And there are significant threats to the eagle we have to be concerned about. Lead poisoning results from lead shot used by hunters that drops into the mud of streams, lakes, and rivers, or is inside the carcasses of waterfowl or deer. Lead fragments are in the gut piles the hunters leave behind to lighten their load as they leave the hunting area and are picked up by scavengers. It can also come from lead sinkers used in fishing. Lead wreaks havoc on an eagle's nervous and digestive systems, causing him to lose weight and eventually die. Shooting continues to be an issue, as do vehicle deaths. M3 was testament to this. Eagles are scavengers, so a roadkill or carcass on train tracks are too enticing for a hungry eagle who will arrive to eat dinner and be hit. AVM, or avian vacuolar myelinopathy, is caused by a toxin in cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, that transfers to eagles through water birds like coots. Wind farms, although a positive resource to counter our use of fossil fuels, can also take out eagles, especially when built near their nesting sites. Immatures, as we have learned, aren't coordinated enough to avoid the giant blades when learning to fly. Other threats like rodenticides, especially SGARs, second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides used by homeowners, businesses, and farmers, are lethal to eagles who ingest the targeted rodents, unwittingly looking for an easy meal. The more insidious threats of habitat loss, which often reduces nest sites by logging or thinning of tall trees or developing lakeshores and rivers, and of course climate change, which affects the food supply the eagle depends on. And our latest and perhaps most serious worry, avian flu, which has taken its toll on many eagles, especially in coastal states like Georgia and Florida, where eagles eat water birds infected with the disease, but also in former eagle strongholds like Michigan and Minnesota. It is believed that this virus killed 600 eagles in 45 states in the last few years. Migrating flocks of snow geese usually winter along the Atlantic coast from New Jersey to South Carolina. On their way south from their breeding grounds in Canada and Greenland, they follow the Atlantic Flyway down the Connecticut River Valley, along the Hudson River in New York, and then through New Jersey and Pennsylvania on their way south to the Chesapeake. This year, thousands of these geese succumbed to the avian flu in eastern Pennsylvania, and at least 1,000 were found dead in New York. Alarmingly, snow geese are a favorite prey item of bald eagles. This bird is too majestic to be ignored again. But as we have seen with many less charismatic birds, if we take our eye off the ball, we lose the brilliant biodiversity we need to make our planet. I hope you can read Return to the Sky if you haven't already done so, but most important, that you are able to enjoy the many bald eagles who have made Virginia and West Virginia their home. Today we can revel in the numbers of wintering birds who visit the Chesapeake Bay Area and the shores of its tributaries like the Potomac and James Rivers, as well as the many nests that can be spotted throughout the state during their breeding season. Thank you all for listening tonight, and I would love to answer any questions you may have. Thank you. Thank you.
You're listening to the Future Conservation Podcast, where we feature thought leaders on the front lines of protecting wild places and wild things, and we share the stories to inspire us to think in a new way. Joining me today in the studio is Tina Morris, author and pioneering wildlife biologist with a background in ornithology from Cornell and anthropology from Oberlin, whose graduate research involved creating the pilot program for releasing American bald eagles into the wild. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. I'm excited to be here.
Let's start with an easy question. What went into your decision to write this book?
It wasn't any one particular reason. I think that everybody had been telling me about how many eagles they saw all the time. And I was always very tempted to say, well, do you know where they came from? Because they sort of thought they materialized out of nothing. And a lot of people were old enough to say, you know, I never saw them when I was younger, or when we were growing up in New England, I never saw a bald eagle. And I wanted to tell them the story, but it sounded so self-serving. Well, I put them back. You can't say that. And so that was one reason. I wanted people to understand the origins of the eagles, where they came from. And the other reason, which was personal on my part, was that Tom Cade, who was my mentor at Cornell, died in 2019. And after he died, I realized that the story would never be told unless I told it. Nobody else was going to write about it. He was the only person that could have done it. And so I felt like I just needed to do it. I needed to do it for him and for the people who helped me in the program, and to thank them, because they had gotten no credit for it. The whole peregrine team had been doing peregrine falcon research, but they hadn't gotten credit for the eagles. So I wanted to give that to them.
Yeah, we're so glad that you did write the book. And the book we're talking about is Tina's book, Return to the Sky, the story of how she helped 7 eagles and restored these eagles into the wild. So in the book, you start with the calling you felt as a child to care for animals. Tell us a little bit about the conundrum you run into when you get to college.
Okay, well, I always thought I would work with animals, so I wanted to be pre-vet when I was younger. And when I got to college and I started off as pre-med or pre-vet, I realized that all of the biology classes that I had to take involved a lot of dissections and a lot of animal working with animals on treadmills and doing experiments on animals, all the things that I didn't want to do. And it went completely against my nature to be able to do that. I also didn't like looking at microscopes all the time. I wanted to be outdoors. And I didn't, at that time, when I was in college, we didn't have the option of being able to do things like ecology. Ecology, the courses hadn't been invented yet. So it was biology in the lab. And it just wasn't me. And so I left science and I went into liberal arts. And I started studying things that really interested me instead. And in the back of my mind, the animal thing was still there. I just didn't know how to do it until I graduated.
That's super relatable, I think, to a lot of young biologists or aspiring folks who would like to work with wildlife, because you don't know what the pathways are,
Right.
and you get to school and you find that there's a lot of dissection, and it doesn't quite align with this regard. And you mentioned regard in chapter 12. You talk about how even though these eagles, I think this is the Patuxent birds we're talking about, were 9 weeks old, they deserved your respect. As does every wild creature, this belief has always guided me.
Yes.
I love how you say that. And I read in your bio that you were formally inducted as an honorary Iroquois into the Confederacy of Six Nations. Would you tell us a little bit about how your connection to the Iroquois unfolded?
Yes, it was quite an amazing experience. At the end of 1977, my second year with the Eagles, in August, right before Labor Day, I got a letter from the Seneca chief of the Iroquois Nation of the Seneca, asking me if I'd come to the Syracuse New York State Fair to be inducted into the Iroquois Nation as an honorary Iroquois for my work with eagles. And of course, as we all know, Native Americans feel very strongly about bald eagles. They use them a lot for their ceremonies, their feathers and things, and a lot of their culture is based on that. And so somebody who was actually trying to save that bird was very important to them. And so I was terrified at the idea that, because it sounded like I was going to be, sort of center stage, and I wasn't very good at doing that at that age. I'm not particularly good at it either, and now anyway. But I said yes because it seemed like this was an honor that I couldn't pass up. So I went up to Syracuse and I spent the day with them, the Six Nations and the chiefs and their wives, and we ate together, and they gave me all kinds of gifts, handcrafted items, and we went to the ceremony, and they even gave me an eagle feather, which is very, very sacred to them. Nobody except for a Native American is supposed to have an eagle feather, and of course I treasure my eagle feather to this day. And so we went through the ceremony. That thing I didn't understand at the time was everything had been pretty much done by the chiefs. And then all of a sudden, when we were in the beginning of the ceremony, all the chiefs stepped to the back of the stage and their wives came forward. And they were the ones who conducted the ceremony and put the headdress on my head and gave me a lot of the really important things that I was supposed to take home with me. And I didn't understand what was happening until the very end, when the wife of the Seneca chief came up to me and said, "Thank you so much for coming, because you are the first woman inductee that we've ever had. So we have never been able to be part of the ceremony. It's always been the men." And she was crying when she said it. And then, of course, I started crying. So that meant more to me than probably anything to do with the entire event. Just to be able to allow the women to be part of it. It was very special.
That's fascinating. And Seneca Falls, you mentioned Chief Seneca, the birthplace of the Women's Rights Convention. So as you were immersed in your own personal struggle to prove yourself, your book is about conservation and field biology and this amazing program with the Eagles, but it's also your own story. Could you share with us a bit about what that was like for you?
Well, I have to admit that Seneca Falls didn't register with me at all while I was on that ridge. I wasn't thinking about it being the sort of the main focal point of the feminist movement and women's suffrage and all these things happening in Seneca Falls. It was something that I was so completely involved in what I was doing and my ability to prove that I could do it, that it never occurred to me that right down the road from me, these women had been doing the same thing. And it didn't happen until way after I was done with the Eagle Project that I realized the significance of Seneca Falls. And in fact, in 2022, when I went back to the refuge to see the birds and to meet the new refuge staff and tell them who I was, they took me into Seneca Falls for lunch and showed me all of the monuments and everything that had been put up for the women's suffrage movement. And all of a sudden I realized that I had been there right down the road and completely ignored the whole thing that was going on around me because I was so completely absorbed in what I was doing and proving myself as a woman, so that nobody could ever say, well, she can't do that because she's a woman. And so it was sort of like the thing that was in parallel, but I didn't know it.
And similarly, you were working with an all-male crew most
Yes,
of the
I
time.
was.
What impact do you feel like you've had on other women biologists who've come behind you?
Oh, wow. I don't know that I don't know if I've had any impact personally on anybody, but I'm hoping that just by people finding out. I mean, I was impacted by people like Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey because I saw that they were women and they were able to do much more than I ever did. And if they could do it, then maybe I could do it. And I was impacted by Rachel Carson because of what she did. I mean, I think that as a woman in science, you're always looking to other women in science and seeing what they're doing. I think it's just natural that you are kind of, impacted by that. So I hope that I've made a difference. I became a teacher because I wanted to make a difference to kids and have them feel empowered in science and be able to feel like they could do it just as well as anybody else could. So.
Fantastic. Jumping back to college. After college, just through sheer determination and your willingness to hold on to a boa constrictor, you got a job as a zookeeper. And you talk about the zoo's library as a retreat. What did the library mean to you at that time?
I guess what I was looking for was a pathway to being able to work with wildlife. And I thought, the zoo seemed like an obvious pathway. And I could find out whether I really wanted to work with animals, and then that would determine whether I wanted to fight hard enough to go back and take all those science classes that I hadn't taken in college in order to be able to do it. And what I found was that I didn't want to work with animals that were in cages. And I remember asking the curator why I was put in charge of the bird exhibits because I like birds, and everybody else wanted to work with the tigers and the elephants. So I asked him why they had no birds of prey, because I'd always been fascinated by hawks and falcons and things like that I'd grown up with. I'd grown up watching them. And he said, because they don't belong in cages. They're a terrible exhibit animal. They need to be free. And that kind of really struck me as being something like, well, if that's the case, then we should really be thinking about conserving them and making sure they don't end up in these zoos. And so I headed to the library to find out more about them. And so I did a lot of research, and I came across a program at Cornell where they were reintroducing peregrine falcons. And it was everything I wanted to do. It was a bird that was free, that they were going to put it back into the wild, and I just wanted to get involved. And I saw Tom Cade's name as being the head of the program. And I said, well, I know I'm not going to work in a zoo for more than a year. I'll get the experience, but now I know my next step. So that's why I headed to Cornell with no science background. So I knew it was going to be an uphill struggle to talk my way into being able to be his graduate student, but I'd suddenly found my goal. So I guess that's what the zoo did for me.
And you did it. You
I
achieved
did
your
it.
goal.
I did it.
So when you pivoted to
Yeah.
Cornell and to academia, wanting to work with peregrines, you show up and you find out you're not going to be working with peregrines. There are all these unexpected outcomes. Tell us a little bit about
Right. So
what that was like.
the first step was that I went to meet him, and I had no science background, and he said, well, you have to take all these science classes before I could even look at you. So I signed up for every science class practically that there was, organic chemistry, physics, all the things that I needed to have a biology major. And so I took lots and lots of science classes for a year. And then I went back to him and I said, okay, here I am, here's my transcript. And he said, this is very impressive, I really think this is great. And I said, well, can I work with the peregrines? And he said, no, because we have plenty of people working with the peregrines, we don't need any more. And then I thought, well, maybe I could work with ospreys. And he said, no, because there's somebody else working with ospreys. So he said, you've got to find a project that's funded and then come back to me. So I was devastated. I thought, how am I ever going to find a funded project with a bird of prey that he doesn't already have a graduate student doing? And so I left, very, very downcast. And that was after that I found out about the Eagle Project.
And how did you find out about the Eagle Project?
Well, I was very lucky, and I ran into somebody who was working in Washington, D.C., and it turned out that New York State, DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, had decided that they wanted to reintroduce bald eagles in 1976 because of the Bicentennial, and they were starting up their endangered species program at the time. So they put a proposal into the federal government, to the Department of the Interior, to do this reintroduction, and they got turned down because they didn't have any raptor specialists on the staff. And so this person who I met, his name is Amos Eno, he was working for the Department of the Interior and Fish and Wildlife Service, and he said, we have that proposal sort of on the side. If you were willing to work with bald eagles and you could convince Tom Cade to do it, we might be able to revitalize this project. So that's how it all happened. They asked Tom Cade if he was willing to do the program, and he turned to me and he said, do you want to do eagles? And I said, absolutely, I would love to do eagles. That's like a dream. And so that's how it all started. And I was enlisted into the Eagle program because of that. And he took me on as a graduate student.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. So you describe once you've gotten set up in the Eagle program, your first night camping on the hilltop next to the newly placed nestlings, and this monsoon happens and you wake up and there's an inch of water in the tent. What goes through your mind?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? Well, I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have anybody to call to say, come and get me. No, it was kind of a wake-up call. I just thought, this is unbelievable. You can start off like this. And I was drenched. My 2 dogs were drenched. All my clothes were drenched. Everything was drenched. So I put the 2 dogs in the Jeep, and we went down to the refuge station. And I called the guys at the peregrine team at Cornell, and I said, I have a problem. I need a new tent. And I think I also probably need new food because the food was all, ruined. And they were up there in an hour. And they said, don't worry, we'll get everything for you. Now, they had already started the peregrine releases at that point. So they had a lot of extra equipment and tents and things like that for the attendants that were taking care of the peregrines in all the different places in New York. So it wasn't like they had to go and buy anything. They just put it all in the pickup truck and drove it up to me. And it continued from there. But, it's just, you just can't count on anything, it turns out.
Your own determination.
Yeah, yeah.
You talk a little bit about loneliness as an emotion that comes up that you didn't really expect, and it was challenging. What did you learn from that, and how did it maybe shape your writing about the story?
I think it's something that I think solitude is very hard. And I think I even mentioned in the book, it's why it's one of the things used for prisoners to punish them. It's a very difficult thing to be alone all the time and not have anyone to talk to. And of course, in this day and age, very few people are alone all the time because of our technology. But back then, I didn't have that communication. So I learned just how to kind of deal with that feeling. And I would do a lot of bird watching and taking bird walks. And I'm a reader. And so I would just delve into novels in other people's lives. And those lonely sort of afternoons when I would be up in the blind looking at two eagles who were asleep for hours at a time and thinking, I'm going to go out of my head. I was reading a book while I was looking at them. I'd write down, if they ever moved, I had to write it down quickly because I was keeping track of all their behaviors. But I find that that reading is a very big solve for me in terms of dealing with loneliness. I don't think that's true for everybody, but it was for me.
And during your time, when you're observing and taking all the data, you talk about how your work was groundbreaking, really, because you learned that hacking could happen and it was successful. The eagles can do what they need to do instinctively. Right. But you also touch on the ideas of objectivity and empathy. What did you learn about objectivity and empathy through your field work?
Well, I guess the objectivity was more that they aren't pets, and I couldn't get too involved with them. I had to stay removed. And one of the reasons that I never named them, everybody always asked me, why didn't you give them names? And I said, they weren't my dogs. They were wild animals, and I wanted them to be as wild as possible. They had to be terrified of humans, so they would never try to go near them looking for food. And they also would fly away when they saw them. And so I think that was sort of the objectivity part, but also trying to get into the head of an eagle a little bit, of watching them day after day after day. And what are these two youngsters thinking during this time when they have no parents around, and what are they going to be able to accomplish? All those things were going through my head. And the empathy part, I think, was more, understanding that I had to take care of them. And they didn't have their parents anymore. So when they got into the middle of the marsh and completely water soaked by falling down because they couldn't fly yet, I knew that they only had one shot at it, and that was me. I had to find them. I had to get them out of there. I had to put them back up on the tower again and tell them to try it again. And when your wings get stronger, you will be able to take off into the sunset, but you're not ready yet. So I guess that was kind of where I was with the birds.
And your work went on to be foundational for eagle recovery across the eastern U.S. What was it like to watch your work be carried forward into the field by other people who are coming in with new sites, new biologists, new technology? And your work has been immensely successful. We've had the quadrupling almost of the population and nests there at Montezuma where you were working.
Right.
So full circle, what was that like for you to have to sort of step aside?
I'd done what I could do for 2 years, and so it wasn't hard for me to leave the program. And I also knew New York State was going to take it over, and they were going to continue it and release many more birds than I would have felt comfortable releasing. I really wanted to take care of each individual bird. I couldn't look at it as being 20 eagles are all going to get released together. So it was time for me to go and let them take that over because they wanted to put a lot more birds into the sky. In terms of other states, I didn't even know. I knew Massachusetts was hacking birds because I knew the person responsible for that program, but I didn't know about the other states. I had no idea all of this was happening. When I left Cornell, my life continued, and so I got into a lot of different things after that and had a lot of different jobs. And I was aware that there were a lot of eagles around. People would tell me how many they'd seen, but I didn't really delve into all of the different states and their programs until I started writing the book. And then I was kind of amazed at how much it had traveled from state to state and how many states had done it. I didn't know Tennessee was hacking birds until 2020. All of this was sort of a surprise to me. So I guess a lot of it was I didn't realize how far-reaching it was. I just knew that they'd been really successful.
And for those that maybe haven't yet read the book, and you can also find Tina's presentation tonight. We're going to be hosting you as a lecturer, and that's going to be recorded. Tell us what hacking is.
Okay, so hacking is a falconer term for taking young birds out of the nest, away from their parents, usually after they've feathered out. And so they've imprinted on their parents. They know that they're a falcon, but they are not ready to fledge. They're not ready to fly yet. So they take the birds and they basically raise them to be a hunter. They hunt with them. And that's where it all began, was them taking these birds out of the eyries or off cliff ledges and things like that. From what I gather, it was the name of the wagon that was used to transport those birds way back when they first started falconry. And that's where the term developed. I didn't even know that until quite recently. But the word hacking is basically birds that are being raised without parents. And it can be applied to any bird. It doesn't have to be just falcons. In fact, a lot of other birds like condors and golden eagles and now ospreys, a lot of these birds are being hacked in order to be able to bolster populations in areas where they haven't been successful.
And you told us that you captured the story because you felt like you had to tell the story or nobody else was going to tell it. Can you share with us, who did you have in mind as your audience? Who do you want to read your book?
Well, I didn't worry that nobody was going to tell it. I worried that no one was going to write it. Because I think that they have told it. I mean, the different states have told their stories about their hacking programs. New York has definitely told its story. I wanted it to be written down so that there are generations beyond us that were going to know about it. Because I have 4 grandsons, or about to have a 4th grandson, and they were on my mind a lot when I was writing this book. It wasn't just about what is old grandma doing, or what did she do when she was younger, but also, would they ever understand what happened to eagles? Would they ever understand what happened with DDT and how awful it was? And we learn from history. And if we can't understand those kinds of threats of a pesticide that we thought was the miracle pesticide of all time, that it was saving us from malaria, and look what happened, then we're not going to learn about what we're doing right now. We're just going to do things for humans and not think about the effects it's having on other creatures. So my feeling was that the story does need to be told, not just because, yes, it was successful, we brought them back, but how much work it took to do that. And we can't do that for every species. The bald eagle's unique. It was the national, well, we thought it was the national symbol. It turned out it became the national symbol in December, this past December, but that's another story. But I felt like we need to have those lessons learned in order to be able to understand what to do going forward.
And what lessons do you feel like we could take from your work with eagles and apply to the little guys? You know, eagles are the charismatic megafauna of the avian world. What about the lesser known smaller species?
We have to be very vigilant about birds. And I think that everybody sort of learned their lesson during the early 1970s, late 60s, when DDT took its toll on all those birds. I think they started realizing that we should have been paying more attention. We should have known those birds were dying off before Rachel Carson figured it out and wrote her book. And we weren't paying attention enough. I think today there are a lot more birders out there. A lot more people are doing citizen science. They're reporting in, they're watching their bird feeders, they're taking all of that information and putting it into eBird and taking it to the Lab of Ornithology and reporting what the patterns are that they're seeing around them. A species can disappear very quickly. And if we don't pay attention and we don't start noticing them, where they are and when they're not there, then we're going to lose more. We already are losing more. The decline of birds is phenomenal right now. So I think that the book says, yes, this was a successful program, but we don't want it to happen again. And even the little birds, you know, there are enough people out there who want to save the little sparrows that you can't recognize one from another, but they are aware that there are some that are really hurting, and how are we going to bring them back? And habitat is huge. We have to preserve their habitat. So, and there's a lot of other things we should be looking at as well, but habitat, I think, is the biggest one.
What do you see as the most pressing issue right now for bird conservation? Is it habitat?
Habitat, yes, because I think everything involves a habitat. It's the food, it's the climate, it's any kind of development has to be considered. What is it doing to habitat of wildlife when it's all being approved? All these things that we're talking about right now are all coming down to what is it going to do to the wildlife populations if we open up everything and say we have to think about ourselves first. I don't necessarily think that that's a good idea. I'm a wildlife fan, and I want them to be preserved, and I think they can't do it themselves. They don't have the power to create their own habitat the way we do. And I think we owe it to them to really be very vigilant and very careful when we go forward.
To bring things into the present, we are getting ready to celebrate America's 250th birthday, and we will be hosting you in the fall as part of our event here at NCTC to talk a bit more about eagles. And you mentioned in the book that you are excited to celebrate the 250th is also the 50th anniversary of eagle reintroduction.
Right.
And you mentioned that you will also be celebrating one particular eagle, and I wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit about M3.
Okay, well, M3 was my rehabbed eagle that was sent to me because he had a broken leg and was found in the nest by the climbers when they went up to find the other birds to send to us. So they took M3 and sent him to the vet college in Minnesota. And he was treated there and rehabbed, and then he was sent to me as my 5th bird in 1977. And he came in after the other birds, so he was sort of a newcomer. And I introduced him to one of the other birds first, and then they were fine together. There were 2 males, 2 young males. I mean, they weren't as developed as the other birds. And he always did fine. And he went into the marsh along with all the others. And I remember thinking how different he was, because when I would fish him out of the marsh, I would always be wrapping them up in a sleeve so that they couldn't flap around and try to kill me with their talons unintentionally. And I remember him just being so calm. I almost felt like I didn't even need the sleeve. I could have just put him under my arm and he wouldn't have struggled at all. He was just a very tame, calm bird and very endearing. And so I always had a thing for him, and I remembered him. Of all the 7 eagles, he was the one that stood out to me, because he'd been through a lot. He'd had to come back from that broken leg. And then I never really, once he left the refuge, like with all the others, I never heard from him again. I never heard anything about him. Nobody ever saw him. And then the next thing I knew, in 2015, I was teaching my class. I was about to pack up my bag to go home for the day in school, and I got a flash on my computer that I had a press release from DEC saying that he had been found by the side of the road, hit by a pickup truck, and he was dead. He'd been going down to eat a rabbit by the side of the road. And they had looked at the band, and they went back to find out that he was one of my 1977 eaglets that I had released, and I knew it was M3 from the number. And I realized that that bird had lived for 38 years from the time that I released him in 77, and he had been nesting nearby for 35 years with 2 different mates. He went through 2 females. They're very, very very loyal to their mates. So one of the females died, and he got another one to come in. And he must have at least had 70 eaglets from that nest. And I just thought that that bird needed a book written about him. You know, he deserved at least that. Because I think it was just such an amazing example of the perseverance and the determination of the bald eagle, that he was able to come back the way he did. And having almost no chance whatsoever of being able to build his populations. And M3 was kind of the symbol for all of that.
We're so glad that you did write his story. thank you for being with us here.
Oh, thank you.
It's been a real pleasure, and we look forward to having you again here at the National Conservation Training Center.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. This was fun.